Buenas tardes. My name is William Rowlandson. I'm Senior Lecturer in Hispanic Studies at the University of Kent. And I have a specialist interest in the long and turbulent history of Cuba in the Caribbean. Over the last few years, my work has taken me way back in time to before the time of Columbus and the indigenous inhabitants of Cuba, the Taino, the Guanahatabey, the Siboney, and the fierce resistance they put up to the Spanish when they started their colonization of the island way back at the end of the 15th century and into the 16th century. The demise of these people and the influx of the enslaved Africans in that long and brutal period of our human history of the Atlantic slave trade, through to the moments of the first stirrings for revolution and independence in the middle of the 19th century, through to the wars of independence of the 1860s and then the 1890s, the intervention of the USA following the explosion of the steamship Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898, the drafting of the Cuban Constitution, engineered almost exclusively by the United States in the early part of the 20th century, and the peculiar amendment to that Constitution that guaranteed almost total control over Cuban affairs by the United States, including the lease, the permanent lease as it's turned out to have been, of the coaling station of Guantanamo Bay. My work's taken me further into the 20th century, looking at the successive dictators, the successive presidents of Cuba, controlled and very much influenced by the United States, culminating in Fulgencio Batista's third term of office in the 1950s, a period characterized by corruption and brutality and cronyism in the Cuban state, leading to the first rumblings of revolution in 1953 with Castro's first revolutionary attack on the Moncada barracks, and onwards through the history of the Cuban Revolution, of the Bay of Pigs, missile crisis, the exodus from Mariel in 1980, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the 1980s, the special period of crisis in the 1990s, and on to the present day. And it interests me a lot to think that whichever candidate is successful and wins the presidential elections in November of this year in the United States, they will be taking on a portfolio of Cuban affairs, Cuba-US affairs, that actually goes back all the way to the 1820s, to the Monroe Doctrine, all the way through the period from the early 19th century to the present day, even if it's not articulated as such. So Cuba bears a long and turbulent history in relation to its relationship with the United States. And as we enter this period, which has been called by the media the Cuban thaw, that's to say the negotiations between Raúl Castro, the president of Cuba, and Barack Obama, in two cases actually brokered by the Pope Francis, once in Canada and once also in the Vatican City. I'm also interested in going back in time and looking, as it were, bookending this period by looking at the early days of the 1960s, of the revolution, in a period that you might, if you want, call the Cuban freeze, if we're talking about the Cuban thaw, the period in which the strained relationship between the Cuban Revolution and the United States' successive presidential administrations became strained to breaking point. And in so doing, the way I've chosen to look at this and the focus by which I'm looking at these early days of the Cuban Revolution is through the perception and the writings of outsiders, not of Cubans, of people who became very interested in Cuba, who followed the developments of the revolution in the 1950s, who followed the rise of the rebel group in the mountains in eastern Cuba, and the demise of Batista's state, the success of the revolution in January 1959, and onwards into the 1960s. And these people who looked at Cuba, in most cases, were prominent artistic intellectuals from the United States, from Spain, France, Britain, and elsewhere. And in that respect, I'm looking at authors who for long have been very dear to me: Greene, Ernest Hemingway, Allen Ginsberg, Julio Cortázar, the Argentine short story writer and novelist, Gabriel García Márquez, the Colombian novelist who died just last year, Pablo Neruda, the Chilean poet, Susan Sontag, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the beat editor, owner of City Lights books, and many others. And what interests me is considering what interested them in Cuba. Why were they drawn to Cuba? Why were they drawn to the revolution? What was it about the revolution that attracted them? How did the changing political scenario of Cuba chime with their vision of reform, their vision of rebellion, their vision of revolution? How did it chime with their vision of ways to address and change and adapt some of the forces of oppression, of injustice, of brutality that they saw quite clearly present in the Cuban state before the revolution? And following the revolution, at what stage did they see cracks appearing in this new and promising regime? At what stage did they see the system itself, which had promised to free the Cuban people of the former tyranny, become itself tyrannical? At what stage did this support that they had provided for the revolution in the early days start to strain itself and crack? And in many cases, such as Julio Cortázar and Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, to the degree that they actually wrote open letters critical of the Cuban Revolution later on. And therefore I'm looking at these authors, at their writings, at how they incorporate questions of revolution, how they ask questions about what really constitutes a revolution, how much of the civic architecture, how much of the infrastructure of society needs to be overturned in order for a series of new reforms to be considered revolutionary. How deep does a revolution go? How severe are the implications of a revolution? How necessary is a revolution in order to change some of these systems that are seen as corrupt and brutal? Let's take the case, for example, of Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. How did they come to be in Cuba? Well, this is a very interesting question. I've been reading Sartre since I was a 17-year-old, and I remember at the time of reading the play Huis Clos how devastating his works were for me, how it overturned my world. And therefore, in that respect, I can say quite categorically from my own perspective that there's something inherently revolutionary in Jean-Paul Sartre, ontologically, philosophically, aesthetically. Carlos Franchi, who was the director of a once clandestine and now official newspaper called Révolution, was in France in October of 1959, keen to engage French intellectuals, in particular Pablo Picasso, who was not French, Le Corbusier, the architect, André Breton, and Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. He was keen to invite them to Cuba, to have them report on the revolution, to engage with the revolution, to speak to the outside world about the development in Cuba. He managed to collar Jean-Paul Sartre during a performance of Sartre's play Les Séquestrés d'Altona at the Odeon in Paris at the end of 1959. And he invited them, and he impressed upon Sartre the nature of the revolution itself, that it was not governed by any ideology, whether it's Marxist or Leninist or any other, that it was pure and simply a revolution, a nationalist revolution designed to overturn the previous tyrannical regime. Well, Sartre and de Beauvoir demurred for a few months whilst they were engaged in other projects, but eventually they took up Franchi's offer, and in February 1960 they arrived in a hot and tropical Havana. Now, the previous few years had been fairly tough for Sartre. I mean, all his years were tough. He'd been engaged in numerous tough projects, including the writing of his very long and dense critique of dialectical reasoning. which had engaged him to such a degree that he'd been on an almost suicidal daily regime of amphetamines, alcohol, tobacco, and barbiturates in order to get him through this writing practice. His good friend and antagonist, Albert Camus, had died just in January of that year. He had been watching with great dismay the ongoing colonial tension in Algeria. He had been reporting on the use of torture by the French in Algeria. He'd been watching the evolving events of the French in Indochina, which, as we know, led to the Vietnam War. And he'd been particularly dismayed at the return to power of Charles de Gaulle following the elections at the end of 1959. And I see all these difficult tensions with Sartre set against a cold, dreary Parisian winter of runny noses and stale tobacco smoke in the cafes, all blown away suddenly by their arrival in hot tropical Havana. And sure enough, it was a lively trip. They were there for a month. They were entertained by the revolutionaries. They were whizzed around the city. They were at the city of Havana. They were invited to talk. Sartre was invited to talk at the university, and he was asked by one of the students about the nature of ideology, and he responded saying that he saw so far that the Cuban Revolution was not governed by ideology. And his response so interested him that actually while he was there, he wrote up an essay that he published in Lunes de la Revolución, which was the cultural offshoot of Carlos Franchi's Revolución, an essay that was called Ideología y Revolución, in which he emphasized the fact that the Cuban Revolution was organic and unmotivated by the ideology. Perhaps naively, we might say in retrospect. He spent time with Che Guevara in the bank offices. Guevara at that stage was the director of the National Bank. He was invited there at midnight, which particularly impressed him. He buzzed around the island of Cuba with Fidel Castro. They all shoved into the back of his state car, and they were entertained in the Zapata swamp at the hut where Castro and his brother would hang out, which Sartre jokingly called the Cuban Rambouillet, the presidential palace in France. And he wrote glowing reports upon his return to Paris, which he didn't publish in L'Express, which is where he'd published much inflammatory material of the 1950s, but instead he chose to publish in François, which was a wide circulating and quite glossy magazine. And these reports he called Ouragan sur le sucre, Hurricane over Sugar, reports about Cuba. Now, these reports are fascinating, and they show so much about this particular moment in Cuba, because it's a particular moment that I think has been overlooked generally by history. And the reason behind that is because most people assume, and perhaps with justification, that the revolution was at its outbreak, at its start, it was part of the Cold War, that Castro and his brother were Marxists, Leninists, that they were allied to the Soviet Union from the beginning, that this was a revolution that set out from its early days to have hard lines, which lead to the repressive nature, the repression of the Cuban people. But of course that's not the case. And Sartre is a very interesting witness to this particular moment, February and March of 1960. This was a time when the trade deals were first being established with the Soviet Union. This is the time before the hostilities had become concrete with the United States. This was a time when still policies were being created on the spot. The Agrarian Reform was in its nascent state, and the Agrarian Reform was really designed to redistribute the land, to overturn the many decades, even centuries, of the foreign ownership of the sugar plantations, the dominance of the sugar industry and the sugar economy in the whole of Cuban affairs. And so it's a particular window in this moment in history which I find fascinating. And the reason I find fascinating beyond anything else is because I asked myself, what would I have done had I been who I am now in 1958, 1959, 1960, Britain? Would I, like Graham Greene, have been drawn to the revolution? Would I have supported Castro? Would I have tried to go to Cuba? would I have written about Cuba? The answer that I have to that is probably yes. You see, so many of the problems that we see inherent in society today, problems of inequality, problems of colonialism, problems of imperialism, problems of neoliberal free market economy that, as we know, is neither liberal nor free. So many of those problems that we see today were equally in play in the 1950s. And they were engaged with, they were critiqued by so many of these authors. They were critiqued in the poetry of Allen Ginsberg, in the writings of Lawrence Ferlinghetti, in the essays of Susan Sontag. They were critiqued by Ernest Hemingway, which is one of the reasons that he lived in Cuba itself, in addition to the fact that the booze was flowing and he could go fishing. They were critiqued by Graham Greene, and his novels and his essays show his ongoing response to the colonialism, to colonialism itself as a problem. And so inevitably, these authors became fascinated by Cuba and supported Cuba. And therefore, what's particularly interesting is to see the tensions emerge when the Cuban state, following the increased hostility with the US and following the alliance with the Soviet Union, adopted increasingly harsh measures towards the Cuban people and towards consolidating the revolution. And how this jarred with so many of these authors, and how they struggled to maintain their support with the Cuban Revolution whilst at the same time critiquing what they saw as increasing repression of the Cuban state. And so with this in mind, I think, what type of systems can we see emerging today? What type of organizations can we see emerging that, like the Cuban Revolution in 1959 and 1960, challenged so many of the established systems that lead to injustice? What systems can we see? What processes can we see today? Or have we been so jaded by the ongoing and perpetual process of revolutions that break down the system and then build up the system in their own way, that we no longer have any hope for any great change? And therefore, whoever does win in the presidential elections in November of this year is going to have to understand that the relationship between the United States and Cuba cannot return to the days of Eisenhower and the days of Richard Nixon, and in particular to the days of George W. Bush, when Cuba was called one of the outposts of tyranny, and it was placed on the axis of evil as one of the state supporters of terrorism. That the only way forward is to engage with Cuba, to engage with the Cuban people, and to understand that such hostility will only lead to increased estrangement of the United States from the international community. And therefore, I'm saying at this stage, in early 2016, that I can only see the future of Cuba as being hopeful. Muchas gracias.